Today on BRStv Investigates, what happens to phosphate and nitrate levels after you feed a combined 200 cubes of frozen food to 4 test tanks for 7 weeks? Coming up, we find out just how effective algae turf scrubbers are at managing phosphate and nitrate levels versus 2 tanks with no filtration whatsoever. Obviously, any filtration is going to be better than none at all, but how effective is a scrubber, and can it perform better than just a protein skimmer alone? Hi, I'm Randy with this Friday's BRStv Investigates, where we put popular reefing gear, theories, and methods to the test by experimenting on our own tanks so you don't have to experiment on yours. And in today's experiment, we're answering the question, when it comes to removing excess organic elements like phosphate and nitrate, is a scrubber just as effective as a protein skimmer? Okay, sure, a protein skimmer has a variety of beneficial uses outside of just removing excess food that leads to excess phosphate and nitrate, but within that context alone, could an algae scrubber outperform a skimmer? This one is personally important to me since I recently revived the 60-gallon cube ULM tank in my office, and after seeing the successes of using algae scrubbers on tanks like Zach's 60-gallon cube here at BRS, where he's chosen to run his tank skimmerless, or Sean's 2,000-gallon tank we just toured, who uses 4 large Clearwater scrubbers and a skimmer, I want to learn as much as possible about scrubbers to find out if it's a viable option for my own reefing approach. I'm sure there are many of you out there like me who have been waiting for some more in-depth information about algae scrubbers, so today we start our scrubber testing journey with a look at how effective they are compared to a set of control tanks. Here's how we approached our first test. As we strive to do with each of our BRStv Investigates testing, we set up 2 redundant experiments for today's test with control tanks 1 and 2 and test tanks 3 and 4 outfitted with Clearwater Scrubber's CW50 algae scrubbers. Each side-by-side Vertex testing tank has an average volume of about 40 gallons, and to run this test, we fed each 1 cube of frozen PE mysis daily for a 4-week period, then monitor their respective phosphate and nitrate levels with little to no competition from additional filtration methods like skimmers or sand in the tank. Additionally, we scraped each of the scrubber test tank screens once per week, as would be expected for the minimal amount of weekly maintenance for the average reefer's tank. Okay, so right up front, before we get into those 4 weeks of results, after the initial 4 weeks, we ramped up the test and doubled our feeding to 2 cubes per day for an additional few weeks to see if we could find a limit to the algae scrubber's effectiveness. The results are pretty interesting, so let's dive into the numbers. As I mentioned, we ran redundant experiments with control tank 1 versus test tank 3 and control tank 2 versus test tank 4. So with that, let's take a look at the phosphate levels for the first 4 weeks of our experiment, where our nutrition input was 1 cube per day in each tank. Starting with the first set of test tanks, I don't think it's any surprise that we see how effective the algae scrubber test tank 3 was at reducing the phosphate levels and maintaining them within commonly acceptable ranges, where in week 1 there was nearly undetectable levels, and then finished the test at just 1/10 of a part per million, whereas there was a steady increase in the control tank 1, starting with 0.3 parts per million and ending at 0.83, or 8 times higher. The same story pretty much holds true for the second set of redundant test tanks 2 and 4 during the first 4 weeks of testing, where we see control tank 2 starting at a similar 0.3 parts per million at 1 cube of food per day, and then ends the test at 0.9 parts per million phosphate. However, the algae scrubber on test tank 4 was able to maintain very low phosphate levels with the same amount of nutrition input, where it started at 0.01 parts per million and ended at 0.08, or 11 times lower. We'll come back and take a look at nitrate in just a bit, but it's safe to say that algae scrubbers undoubtedly have a major impact on excess phosphate at 1 cube a day nutrition input, but we're not done yet. What happens if you double the amount of food to 2 cubes per day? Will the algae scrubbers be able to keep up? Looking at the first set of test tanks 1 and 3, we see that tank 1, with double the amount of food, pretty much doubled in the amount of phosphate buildup by the end of the test, where it started at 0.83 parts per million and rose to 1.69 parts per million by week 7. Test tank 3 looks to have a greater impact from double the amount of food, where it rose from 0.08 parts per million phosphate up to 0.51 parts per million, which may suggest that we have reached the export capacity for this size of scrubber, however still remains about 3 times lower in phosphate concentration overall versus control tank 1. Redundantly, in tanks 2 and 4, there's a nearly identical tail, with the control tank 2 gaining 0.86 parts per million phosphate from week 4 to week 7, where it starts at 0.89 and ends at 1.73. Again, as with the first experiment, the phosphate in test tank 4 also climbs with double the amount of food, where it gains 0.43 parts per million phosphate from week 4 at 0.08 to week 7 at 0.51 parts per million. However, in the end, test tank 4 is still 3 times lower than the control tank without any filtration whatsoever. As I mentioned, we also monitored nitrate levels for each of the tanks, but as we've come to learn from a multitude of attempts at testing nitrate, it's notoriously difficult to test for accurately in saltwater using our hobby grade test kits. So for those who are curious, here are the numbers for each tank throughout the entire 7-week period. Basically, in both control tanks 1 and 2, we saw a nitrate range between 5 and 12 parts per million, while in the test tanks 3 and 4, we registered right at 1 or less than 1 parts per million throughout the entire test. I'd rate our question of, is a scrubber just as effective as a protein skimmer when it comes to reducing excess phosphates and nitrates, a full 10 out of 10 on the Reef certainty scale. For the sole purpose of nutrient control alone, I've personally never seen a skimmer remove nitrate and phosphate completely or as effectively when it was the solitary filtration method. Obviously, a scrubber needs to be sized to the nutrition input, and this smaller size seemed to be optimized to 1 cube a day in our case, but as long as it's matched to the feeding habits, it seems to be a viable standalone filtration approach. You know, I've also never seen a skimmer-only system that was able to effectively outcompete the tank display lights and prevent algae growth in the display altogether. But given today's results with an algae scrubber, do you think the scrubber alone could help maintain a hassle-free and pristine display tank? Find out what happens in our next test when we turn on the lights in the front of these test tanks and see if the scrubbers are able to keep algae from growing on the rocks. You can catch that next experiment and all of our eye-opening refugium tests in this playlist over here, so check it out.